When Sally Rooney's new novel Intermezzo was released in September, there were queues of people, mostly millennial women, lined up outside independent bookshops for the chance to buy the book and also to receive the limited edition tote that the publishers were giving out with early purchases. This obsession with a material good, well known for its environmental baggage, may seem strange, especially considering that Rooney is an author whose self-avowed Marxism intrigues as much as it raises eyebrows among the chattering classes. But it is not the first time for Rooney. When Normal People was released, a Vanity Fair photo shoot combined a copy of the book with a Mansur Gavriel bag carrying a price tag of $595. Now, this hyperconsumerism is more the fault of the publisher than of Rooney herself, but it does highlight some of the criticisms that critics have made of Rooney's work. In Vulture, Christian Lorentzen said that the politics of Rooney's characters were mostly gestural. Others have derided the idea that there is anything really about class in Sally Rooney's works at all, acting as if the politics are more setting than subject. Now, to me, some of this criticism reads as boomers' dismissal of younger people for having politics more radical than their own, both condescending and ignorant, but some of it we have to take in good faith. So then, the question is, does Sally Rooney write about class, or just dress her characters in the language of it? I think some of the dissonance arises from different definitions of the word class. As I said earlier, Sally Rooney is an avowed Marxist. And so whilst those claiming that she is not writing about class may be using the colloquial definition with its ideas of lower versus middle versus upper class, which does focus on financial status, but for which cultural markers are also an important part, Rooney herself may be considering it from a Marxist lens. Rooney has described Marxism as the analytical structure that helps me make sense of the world around me, and of this colloquial versus Marxist use of the term class, she says, from the Marxist point of view, people who work for a living rather than making money from capital are workers, members of the working class. But in contemporary colloquial use, the term working class is used much more restrictively, applied only to the particular communities or workers in particular industries. These uses of the term are not really interchangeable at all. They mean very different things. So of course, when we try to talk about class using this terminology, we run into confusion and disagreement. So we are talking about class stratification as we understand it on a day-to-day level. Ideas of things such as lower middle class or working class culture falls into this category, versus a theoretical framework based on where people sit in relation to the means of production, in which there is only really proletariat and bourgeois, working class and capitalists, although there have been ideas such as the petit bourgeois and the professional managerial class. The Marxist ideas are broad and universal. The colloquial ideas are less concrete and vary regionally. More on that later. Sally Rooney's books explore how capitalism interacts with human relationships. Her characters are all workers, not capitalists, whose lives are to a greater or lesser extent affected by the whims of the market. And in her more recent works, the friction between this Marxist and colloquial understanding of class has become the subject of her novels. But while she is writing novels from a Marxist lens, I don't think that the colloquial understanding of class is completely absent from her work. As I said earlier, when we are discussing the colloquial understanding of the word class, cultural markers are an important point of what we mean. And as good materialists, we know that such markers are dependent on the social and cultural space in which they exist, which is a complicated way of saying, for those of you who haven't noticed, Sally Rooney is Irish. This means that the markers of class and social status will be different than they will be for people from other countries. And this is something that can be easily missed for those of us who did not grow up in that same milieu. For example, when me and Doz were discussing Babel by R.F. Kuang, we both noted how her concept of the British class structure seemed fairly superficial. So she didn't seem to truly understand the nuances and how it works, because she is not, although she is a writer that has studied in the UK, she hasn't grown up in it, which I think can be important. I think that when we are reading books that are translated or are from cultures very different from our own, we know that in order to truly understand it, we have to gain some understanding of the cultural context of the work. But I think rather than doing that work with Irish readers, a lot of the Anglosphere make assumptions. So while Marxist understandings of things like alienation, commodity fetishism, cultural hegemony, etc. can be understood around the world, and issues such as the housing crisis and the rural versus urban divide and precarity can be understood no matter your starting point, there are aspects of class in Sally Rooney's work that are specific to the Irish context in which she is writing. And therefore, those elements of class distinction could easily be missed if you're not familiar with that culture. People who say things like, Marianne was a hot girl, why would she ever have been unpopular, clearly have never been to a country where wearing a red beret can be enough to get you called Super Mario. I will leave a link to a Twitter thread in the comments down below for things that have happened to Irish people for wearing anything slightly outside of the norm. And while American critics such as Jennifer Wilson feel confident in saying of characters such as Beautiful World, Where Are You's Felix, rather than give us a glimpse into what might constitute working class culture, Felix appears to exist in a cultural void. This cultural void comment feels baffling to writers such as Sean O'Neill, who comment on the fact that Felix sings a song that is a traditional Irish song that is used in James Joyce's The Dubliners, and therefore harks back to the slow loss of Ireland's oral culture and is a link to the literary and musical context in which Felix is living, and the importance of Irish literary and musical tradition. Even Margaret's fear of judgment for starting a relationship with a much younger man after her divorce may seem very old-fashioned to those of us who live in cities that are not in Catholic countries. But I personally remember staying in B&Bs with my dad and his girlfriend, and then his girlfriend constantly being referred to as his wife, despite the fact they have different names and there is no evidence of that, just because that is what is expected. You probably know Ireland is a very small country, but it has been said that the differences between it feel larger. The west of Ireland, where Conall and Marianne grow up and where Alice gets a house in Beautiful World, Where Are You, was previously known for having terrible roads and being quite inaccessible. And it still has issues with things like broadband connectivity that means that it feels very separate from the capital. Even though the distance between Mayo and Dublin is similar to that of London and Manchester, and they are closer to each other than New York and Boston. In normal people, it's not just Sligo to Dublin, but to Trinity College specifically, the former bastion of the Anglo-Irish, whose buildings are literally built with the money from the British Empire, that marks such a stark change. Conall himself notes the feeling of two entirely separate existences. This difference between Dublin and the West is also noted by Nick in Conversation with Friends, by his casual reference to his family used to have a home out west, and by Alice, who's constantly putting her foot in it when she rents a house there. The discrepancies culturally, but also class-wise, are clear here. Ireland also, unlike the UK and the US, is a country of emigrants rather than of immigrants. And so Connell's potentially travelling to New York to work as a writer at the end of Normal People may seem a bourgeois happy ending coming of age story to those not familiar with the Irish context. To those familiar with the context of the place where the young and the bright cannot afford to stay in the country, there is a bittersweetness to this ending. Ireland has experienced waves of people leaving from the famine in the 1860s through to waves of mass emigration in the 1950s when my grandparents came to this country, to the 1980s when my mum came to this country. So when it says in Beautiful World, Where Are You, several of Eileen's friends had recently left or were in the process of leaving Dublin, it doesn't necessarily just mean the move from city to suburbs that are common to people across the world, but people leaving the country. Ireland is also unique in Western Europe as a country that has never had a left-wing government. And though there have been great social changes over the years through referendums on the Eighth Amendment and therefore abortion and on gay marriage, there is not an institutional left in the same way that there is in other countries. As Sally Rooney herself said, the deterioration of the power of the Catholic Church was replaced pretty much wholesale with the power of the free market. And so while the looseness of the political connections of the characters in Sally Rooney's works is seen by some as merely gestural, it is a signifier of the rootlessness of that kind of politics in the country itself. Ireland may seem like just another Anglosphere country to those unfamiliar with it, but its status as a post-colonial country in the EU, on the periphery of the EU, is fairly unique. It was a fairly poor country until it experienced unfettered and unequal growth in the period of the 1990s and early 2000s, known as the Celtic Tiger, only to be hit dramatically by the 2007 and 2008 financial crisis when it became one of the countries who were worst hit, and therefore ended up at the brute end of the IMF and ECB policies, bringing in extreme austerity measures. This makes its financial experience closer to countries like Portugal and Poland, or even South Korea, than to countries like the UK and the USA. Sally Rooney's first two novels are set in this period, when the hope and rapid growth of the 1990s turned to the neoliberalisation of the post-financial crisis moment, and there was a loss of hope and social mobility that accompanied this. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about neoliberalism, and it has been a word that has been applied to a lot of different things, but in this context, I am time using it to talk about the type of politics that arose in the 1980s and rapidly intensified after the financial crisis, and is most associated with a turn to the free market, a bonfire of regulations, and a removal of the social safety net, all of which has led to a widening inequality and feeling of precarity. Rooney said, "It would have been really difficult for me to write about young people leaving home in the west of Ireland, moving to college, and not confront the economic disparities that were emerging at the time, like the stripping back of protections for people of working class backgrounds. One of the clearest examples of the economic and political moments in which normal people is set is when Connell and Marianne go to visit what Connell refers to as the Ghost, an unfinished house in an unoccupied housing estate built during the Celtic Tiger, a physical manifestation of the loss of hope I mentioned earlier. Why don't they give them away if they can't sell them? I'm not being thick with you. I'm genuinely asking." Marianne shrugged. She didn't actually understand why. "It's something to do with capitalism," she said. "Yeah, everything is. That's the problem, isn't it?" And this exchange links to one of the more divisive elements of Sally Rooney's writing style, her self-consciously class-conscious characters. So while critics are saying that Sally Rooney doesn't really engage with class in her works, her characters are certainly aware of their own class. They are aware of where they fit in the striations of the society in which they live and how these class divergences affect their relationships with one another. Normal People is the most read of her books, and so the book most likely to draw the criticism of not being about class. But at the same time, Connell is one of the clearest representations of working class anxieties in any of the books she has written. Connell and Marianne's relationship is a dance based on power imbalances, and these come from various different angles, including gender and popularity, but crucially also because his mother is a cleaner for her family. Connell is a working class boy, and this class-based tension only increases when they travel to Trinity College in Dublin, and Connell develops a sense of crushing inferiority. His perspective is filled with constant awareness of the discrepancies between his own experience and that of his much richer classmates. This is what it's like in Dublin. All Connell's classmates have identical accents and carry the same size MacBook under their arms. In seminars, they express their opinions passionately and conduct impromptu debates. And he later notes of a reading held in a local bookstore that it is culture as class performance. The fact that he has to share a room with another student because he can't afford to live alone is greeted with horror by Marianne's upper-class friends. And he comments that money is the substance that makes the world real. Whilst Connell's socioeconomic status changes later in the book when he receives a scholarship, his class anxieties are not so easily shaken. In his relationship with the snobbish upper-class women, this feeling of inferiority jumps out. Feeling suddenly cornered, Connell fell silent again. This silence is at the heart of the novel, at the heart of the anxieties that Connell and Marianne are experiencing. It causes them to be unable to communicate with each other, unable to say what they mean, or unable to be truly understood. I know some readers have criticised this, wishing the characters would just speak to one another, but if you have always been able to tell the person you like exactly what you're feeling and exactly what you need from them, I applaud your complete lack of self-consciousness and suggest you may be the exception rather than the rule. One of the central moments of missed connection in the novel comes when Connell is no longer able to afford to stay in Dublin over the summer and needs to travel back to Sligo. He could ask to stay with Marianne, and he does consider it, but his feeling of class anxiety and shame in relation to money stop him from being able to do so. He wants Marianne to come up with the idea on her own. But she, not having experienced what he is experiencing, doesn't know that's what he's asking, and thinks he just doesn't like her enough to stay, leading to them breaking up. As Jose Carregal Romero writes, drawing on the author's remark that her stories develop in post-crash Ireland, where young people have become highly aware of inequality, yet unable to fight against it, Darling argues that Rooney's characters represent the paralysis of capitalism, in which millennial experiences and choices are predetermined by crippling capitalist norms. Rooney's two later novels feel like they are, to some extent, making obvious what was subtext in the books that came before, so that no one can say she isn't writing about class. Eileen and Alice in Beautiful World, Where Are You? Exchange emails about Marxism, capitalism, neoliberalism, the futility of individualism, commodity fetishism, etc., etc. And these emails take up nearly half the book. They identify as Marxists, and their politics are front and centre of what it is they discuss. But those politics affect their real life as well. The issue, as I said earlier, of what we mean by class, of who is the capitalist and who are the workers. Eileen and her partner Simon have known each other since they were children and have gone to similar schools. But while both their jobs have a certain cultural cachet, she as an editor of a literary magazine and he working for a leftist political movement, Simon is the only one who earns any real money. The dissolution of the professional managerial class into low-wage proletarialized workers like Eileen and elite professionals serving capital like Simon are outlined in the essay Death of a Yuppie Dream by Barbara and John Einrich, a follow-up to their 1977 essay The Professional Managerial Class, in which they coined this term. Rooney uses this couple to explore the ideas expressed in Death of a Yuppie Dream, and when this pair meet up with Alice and Felix, these ideas become the text of the novel. Felix is a blue-collar proletariat worker who works in a warehouse, and he sees himself as culturally different from the other three, feeling a separation from them because they are middle class, until the point that he learns that Eileen actually earns less money than him, and there begins to be a sense of class solidarity between them. In Sally Rooney's new novel, Intermezzo, these ideas are even more blatant. One of our main characters, Peter, is a lawyer, and though I believe he works in some sort of human rights aspect of it, he definitely has a lot more money than his girlfriend, Naomi, who is 9 years younger than him and who is a squatter and a sex worker, sharing images on a site that is probably OnlyFans. Her relationship with her landlord becomes a subplot of the novel, but the power dynamics in her relationship with Peter are spelled out by him. Someone just seems like they have to be exploiting someone here. He, her financially, sexually, or she, him financially, emotionally. It can be exploitative to give money, but also to take it. And Peter's brother Ivan also has a monologue in which he expresses ideas of the alienation of work under capitalism and commodity fetishism very clearly. He talks about the difference between his work as in data for financial institutions and the amount that they pay him having no relation to the work that he is actually doing, compared to his work as a Deliveroo driver, where someone is paying him to retrieve the burger. They're paying him for the time and ease of not having to retrieve that burger himself. And so the connection between the work he is doing and what he's receiving are much more clear. But there is also commodity fetishism at play in this work. The delivery service has no value outside of its context. The feeling of malaise and anxiety that pervades all of Rooney's millennial characters and her Gen Z characters, I think Ivan and Naomi are both Gen Z, are part of the alienation and atomization caused by neoliberalism. And these feelings infect the relationships that all the characters have with one another in her book. Some readers of her works see this class consciousness as performative, however. Becca Rothfield says that characters such as Connell and Marianne perhaps typify the impotence and hypocrisy that abound in the fashionably leftist community she described. When Connell tells Marianne that he was late for coffee because there was a protest about the household tax or something, Marianne replies, "Well, best of luck to them. May the revolution be swift and brutal." Then she and Connell get back to their convoluted relationships and their cappuccinos. She describes the watered-down Marxism that affluent millennials claim as a personal brand, and says her characters don't make any good faith efforts to improve the state of the world. As if for a work to be about class, the characters have to be activists. Connell does attend a pro-Palestinian march, but I guess this doesn't count for Rothfield. But Rooney, as I said, Rooney is focused on what Carregal Romero refers to as the paralysis of capitalism, in which millennial experiences and choices are predetermined by crippling capitalist norms. By saying that Sally Rooney's character's politics is vapid and merely a costume, we ignore that one of the themes of the novel is the tension in their political ideology, the friction between their beliefs and the actions they feel capable of taking. As Michael Lazarus says, Rooney is challenging the readers to understand her characters in political term. Rooney's novels revolve around relationships, much like one of her professed inspirations, Jane Austen. She's using the subject of relationships to explore the culture and society in which she lived. Rooney's novels, in basic plot, revolve around characters' relationships to one another, but those relationships are continually butting up against the material realities of life. She has said that she writes about the transactional nature of relationships, how it's so difficult to escape the transactional framework of capitalism which dominates our whole existence. While Connell and Marianne love each other, they find it hard to say so. Alienation pervades their whole relationship. And this is political too, the anxiety and disconnect caused by capitalism. As Jenny Farrell says, in Rooney's work, the political manifests itself in the depiction of alienated relationships alongside political statements. The transactional nature of love is explored explicitly in relationships like that between Peter and Naomi, whose reasons for being together Peter constantly ruminates on. She is a 24-year-old in a precarious housing situation who sells explicit pictures of herself in order to survive, and he is the wealthy 33-year-old who sleeps with her, giving her money and a place to stay. He's constantly questioning how they feel about each other, how much is genuine, and how much is based on money, gratitude, convenience, exploitation. The contradictions between the characters' politics and their political actions are linked to this too. The characters are caught between their explicit critique of political conformism and their inability to escape the alienated norms that binds them into passivity and personal conformism. This conformism being both a lack of concrete political action beyond a few protest attendances, and the way that these characters end up, such as Simon and Eileen, with marriage and property ownership. These people who are struggling to love one another among neoliberalism and individualism are nonetheless falling into their assigned societal boxes. But are we to take this at face value? In Eileen's final letter to Alice, she seems to be content and happy with this result of her relationship. But is this proclamation sincere? Rooney's characters continually, throughout all of her works, use silence and irony to hide their own vulnerabilities and their own true feelings. Neoliberalism causes us to hide our feelings in the name of self-sufficiency, leading to avoidance, silences, willful blindness of other people's feelings, all of these things that are themes in Rooney's novels. In contrast to these silent, alienated characters, Rooney told the New York Times, "I find myself constantly drawn to writing about intimacy and the way we construct one another. While her characters may be constricted by the society in which they live, they also impact upon one another and change one another. They may be isolated individuals in some ways, but Rooney rejects individualism, really, with her insistence on interrelation and interdependence, which can be seen to be an anti-capitalist point. Connell and Marianne end up like two plants sharing the same pot of soil, growing around one another, contorting to make room, taking certain unlikely positions. And when grief finally overtakes Peter in Intermezzo, his two great loves come together to support and help him, reflecting the way he has been cruelly and offhandedly taking care of them throughout the entire novel. No one can exist outside of other people is one of the themes of Sally Rooney's work. And when Peter allows himself to let go of neoliberal ideas of self-reliance and of the expectations of nuclear family and shame associated with Catholicism, he, Naomi, and Sylvia can begin to work on a place of mutual care. Instead of garnishing her love stories with politics, as Annalisa Quinn says, she's embedding politics closely and rigorously in the love story, showing how relationships can function like miniature states and how political principles can work on an intimate scale. In Normal People, Connell is allowed to help Marianne in the face of her violent brother, not because he is a knight in shining armour fulfilling a romance fantasy trope, but because as a man he's aware of the power that this affords him, from his ability to her need. I will finish with this quote from Andrea Long Chu, which I think sums up what I'm trying to say. I love Andrea Long Chu as a literary critic, and I think I have used their works in a lot of my videos, including the one on A Little Life, which I will leave in the cards above. But here's the quote. "Over and over, Rooney characters put their faith in love as a means of escape from their conventional roles assigned to them by society and by each other. No sooner have they achieved this than they are rudely confronted by the inequalities of wealth, status, and power that are clearly fatal to their idealism, but not to love itself. I take this to be the modest provocation of Rooney's novels, the idea that love is real precisely because it is a product, one created by social conventions, by market forces, by systems of violence, and behind all of this, by human beings themselves. This is not, I admit, a Marxist theory of love. It is something more expected, a lover's theory of Marxism." Thank you for watching my video. Please let me know in the comments down below your thoughts. How do you feel about the use of class in Sally Rooney's novels? I'd love to hear from you, so please do leave that below. If you are new here, my name is Roisin. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon. Bye bye.